I figured it's a good place to also put these 10 principles as listed by this report from the Economics of Energy Innovation and System Transition. So we talked about energy system transitions needed for the 1.5 degrees C global warming target with 67% probability by 2100. This report shows what is needed in terms of policy making. So 10 principles for policy making in the energy transition, lessons from experience. So it lists traditional principles and principle for the transition, and I will show one example where after listing these 10 principles, it then compares in detail the traditional principle and the principle for the transition. I won't go through all of them, but I just wanted to put it here so that if you wanted to follow up, you can follow up if you're a policy wonk or interested more in the policy of energy transitions. Okay, system transitions for these energy moving into the new system needed for mitigation and adaptation. So the traditional principle and principle for transition are listed with summary in each case. Number one, policy should be technology neutral, but for the transition, technology choices need to be made. In other words, there is nothing like being technology neutral. In a context of innovation and structural change, policies will almost always advantage some technologies more than others. It's better to choose deliberately rather than accidentally, supporting innovation in low carbon directions. Some policies intended to be neutral can have a bias towards incumbents and incremental change. So it's kind of the carbon trap that we talked about in another context, where right now every investment of the infrastructure, the manufacturing processes, everything is geared towards fossil fuel energies, and transitioning out of them will require that we don't stick to some kind of a technology neutral approach, which tends to maybe bias towards what exists already called incumbents, or it may lead to just incremental change, whereas what is needed is a quantum jump to the transition for making the transition possible. Secondly, the government interventions raise costs is the traditional way of thinking, but in the principle for the transition, we need to invest and regulate to bring down costs. Well-designed investment and regulation policies can bring down the cost of clean technologies by creating a demand pull for innovation that complements the supply push of research, development, and demonstration, strengthening learning by doing feedbacks in technology development, deployment, and diffusion. So if you let the market forces work the way they generally work, there is always some research going on. For example, now it's all about research for increasing efficiency of photovoltaic cells and the wind energies. You can think of other forms of energies like nuclear, fission, fusion, wave energies, etc. But well-designed investment and regulation policies should bring down costs of clean technologies by creating a demand pull rather than research trying to push out the latest innovation. Thirdly, markets on their own optimally manage risks is the way we generally think of, but for the transition, actively managing risks to crowd in investment is needed. So low carbon transitions involve many sources of uncertainty. Efforts to reduce the risks of private investment in clean technologies, including public finance acting as a lead investor, can reduce technology risk and financing costs and greatly increase rates of investment and deployment. So this is a faster way to move towards the energy system transition that is needed. Fourthly, simply price carbon at a level that internalizes the damages of climate change. Simply price carbon at a level that internalizes the damages of climate change. New way of thinking would be to target the tipping points. Elsewhere, I have some podcast on how there are potential tipping points in bringing about social transitions, including energy system transitions. So here, well-targeted interventions can activate tipping points in technology competitiveness, consumer preference, investor confidence, or social support for transitions where a small input leads to a large change. This can inform targeting and level of subsidies and taxes, as well as the stringency of regulations. Okay, so that's the traditional to new principles. Fifth, consider policies individually based upon distinct market failures is the way we would think traditionally, but for the transition, combine policies for better outcomes. A combination of policies will be needed to drive each low-carbon transition. Since the effect of each policy depends on its interactions with others, assessing policies individually can be misleading. Assessing policies as a package can identify those that are mutually reinforcing, generating outcomes greater than the sum of the parts. So if there are multiple policies intended to, for example, phase out coal, phase out oil and gas versus phase in renewables, then they should not be considered separately. Together, maybe they will accelerate the whole process of phasing out fossil fuels and phasing in renewables, as an example. Sixth, policy should be optimal in the traditional sense, but now policy should be adaptive so that we are constantly responding to the positives and the negatives of the policy adoptions. There are many paths along which economies can develop over time. It's often impossible in practice to identify which is the best in terms of public goals or even least cost economically, which implies there may be no single optimal policy in a theoretical sense. Given also the potential to learn from experience, policy should be designed to be adaptive so that it can more easily correspond to unforeseen changes, exploit opportunities, and manage risks. Okay. Seventh, traditionally, we act as long as total benefits outweigh the costs, but in the transition principle, put down distributional issues at the center. Okay, low carbon transitions inevitably involve transfers of economic resources. Distributional issues should be central to policy analysis since they are important for environmental, economic, social goals and are likely to have a strong bearing on social support for transition. Okay. Eighth, link carbon markets to minimize costs. Minimize current costs is how we would think of traditionally. In the transition, the principle would be to coordinate internationally to grow clean technology markets. So not just local and national markets, but coordinated global markets. Countries should coordinate internationally to grow clean technology markets in each of the emitting sectors of global economy. This can lead to faster innovation and larger economies of scale, accelerating the cost reduction of clean technologies with benefits for all countries. Economies of scale is something you probably know, that to manufacture one unit it may cost X, but manufacturing 10 units would cost much less per unit. So there is an advantage to producing larger amounts as needed, and global coordination would naturally exploit the economies of scale in this case. Traditionally, you would want to assess aggregate costs and benefit, but for the transition, assessing opportunities and risks would be the good principle. Policy appraisals should consider risks and opportunities, not just costs and benefits, when unquantifiable or very uncertain factors are likely to be important. Where the aim is transformational change, appraisal should consider the effects of policies on processes of change in the economy alongside their expected outcomes. Okay, so this is about anticipating opportunities and risks and not just focusing on aggregate costs and benefits. Finally, policy models and assessment are neutral in the traditional assumption, but now we have to know our biases. The construction of economic models unavoidably involves many choices that will influence their outputs, in which there are no correct answers. We should be aware of our biases, make model choices transparently, and Where possible, use a range of models instead of a single one. So multi-model approaches have proven to be very useful in the physical climate predictions, projections, and so on. So economic models can do the same. As an example, to go into a little bit about details about the traditional principle and the new principle for energy system transfer, let's look at principle 1. Technology choices need to be made. Traditional principle says policy must be technology neutral, and the summary we looked at said in a context of innovation and structural change, policies will almost always advantage some technologies more than others. It's better to choose deliberately rather than accidentally supporting innovation in low carbon directions. Some policies intended to be neutral can have a bias towards incumbents and incremental change. So the system inertia may be keeping the change towards biased towards incumbents or existing technologies or industries and corporations that are in the current technology and allow only incremental change. So to look at the differences, rationale for the traditional principle, it is common to hear in the energy and climate policy arena that policy should be technology neutral. In other words, that broad-based market incentives should drive technology choices to ensure cost-effective greenhouse gas emission reductions. The goal of technology neutrality is often invoked by arguing that policies and governments should not pick winners and that they should allow competition between alternative technologies on an assumed level playing field. It is also used in the context of concerns of regulatory capture of public authority by private interests. In the appropriate context, technology neutrality can be a powerful tool that can foster the emergence of new ideas, for example, when having research and development funding rounds that are open to different technologies or providing some level of block funding so that everybody can test their new ideas and developments. And price discovery, flexibility, and competition is also part of the technology neutrality, for example, in the context of carbon pricing. In addition, some classic empirical work demonstrates cases in which picking technologies can be driven by or lead to cronyism, that is the favoring of connected people for the government roles or contracts on a non-competitive basis, or can lead to government failure. In economic terms, governments as well as markets can be beset by failures compared to the theoretical best that is supposed to be achieved. In the new policy for transition, limitations to the traditional principles can be looked at this way. In spite of the prominence of the concept of I'm having trouble reading, sorry. In spite of the prominence of the concept of technology neutrality, it is often poorly defined and understood. One reason for this is that depending on the policy instrument, context, and policy objective, technology neutrality is sometimes used to discuss avoiding, favoring, or picking industry sectors, parts of the energy system, example transport versus electricity, different technologies to generate electricity, for example wind versus solar or onshore versus offshore, or specific technology designs, for example particular direct air capture project for demonstration. In other words, in some cases the technology part seems to be referring to uses, in others to devices, and at different levels of granularity, and thus the principle of technology neutrality is hard to define. It's not just one technology being compared to others and making a neutral choice. Technology neutrality is also a concept that is difficult to implement in practice and in some circumstances impossible. Most obviously, in research and development, a program may support a range of technologies, but it cannot support everything. Something has to be researched and something has to be developed. Some choices have to be made, less obviously, but equally importantly, the effect of a market shaping policy in a particular sector will have different impacts on different technologies. A policy that has the impact of encouraging the uptake of the least cost opportunities for short-term emissions reduction will tend to encourage the deployment and therefore further development of clean technologies that are relatively mature, and so lower cost more than those that are less so at present. So how to make the principles adaptive rather than traditional in terms of technology neutrality has to be kept in mind. Okay, so that's just an example of how each principle is compared for traditional approach versus the new approach that is needed now for energy innovation and system transfer. Okay, I will leave it there. You can go find the report and read the details and where the experiences are brought to bear on devising these new policy making for energy transfer, but I won't get to details here in that sense. Okay.